The love and blessings of the Mother and Sri Aurobindo to all of you from Sri Aurobindo Ashram, Delhi branch. We are currently doing a series on the pioneers in mind-body medicine and why it is important to understand the mind-body relationship for any system of medicine is something which is to some extent common sense. You know, we all know that when we are under stress, that is the time when we are also likely to fall sick. Children get their examination fever when the examination is around, and that is because of the examination stress. On the other hand, when we are happy and cheerful, we fall ill much less often. But then this something which is a very common observation is something that modern medicine had forgotten till about 1950. Till about 1950, starting with say around 1900. Because within a rather very short span of about 50 years, concentrated in the years 1900 to 1950, modern medicine made some spectacular advances which did not require the mind-body relationship and yet succeeded in wiping out some of the major killers of mankind like infectious disease through the use of vaccines and antibiotics, and nutritional deficiencies like pellagra, which used to be killer diseases, by the discovery of vitamins, which could now be packed in a pill and given. And the result was that modern medicine forgot the mind-body relationship. It went into sort of an eclipse. And therefore, the pioneers who started rediscovering the mind-body relationship had an uphill task. Not only they were thinking along lines which were unconventional and required some very original sort of an approach. When they discovered something, it was not well received. They were looked upon as people who were rather unscientific in their approach. But then you can't keep the truth down. And the result was that within a period of less than 25 years, starting around 1950, by the time it was around 1975, once again, mind-body relationship came to be accepted, and accepted even better than it was in the earlier eras when it was centered more around common sense and so on. Because now there was plenty of scientific evidence available in its favor, and therefore it became more acceptable to mainstream medicine. So it was these pioneers that we are talking about, and luckily, you know, the mind-body relationship works both ways. When we are under stress or we are unhappy, we are more likely to fall ill. But then at the same time, if we are relaxed, cheerful, our heart is full of joy, we are also likely to stay healthy. And if we fall sick, we are likely to recover much faster and more completely. So it works both ways. And that is why understanding the mind-body relationship is important for any system of medicine. The pioneer that we are going to talk about today is Herbert Benson. And before I go into his life and works, I'll read out a few lines from his very famous book, The Relaxation Response, which we shall refer to during the talk also. And please listen carefully, because these lines have a sort of a quiz for you. If you owned a factory and a sales representative called on you to sell you a miracle machine that would never fail to distribute vitally needed materials to all points of your plant, your plant means a factory. So this salesman is telling you that it's trying to sell you a miracle machine that will supply and distribute whatever is needed by any machine in the plant, in the factory, and at the right time, in the right quantity, it will distribute the vitally needed materials to all points of your plant, say materials like raw material, etc. Then you'd probably give him a few minutes of your time. You'd think that's something important, and if this machine can actually deliver the goods, then it's worth listening to this salesman. When he told you this machine was designed to last over 70 years and pump more than 2.5 billion times, indeed, circulating between 40 and 80 million gallons of essential fuel to keep your factory functioning, you might begin to doubt that such a fantastic device really could exist. Yet every living man and woman in the world possesses just such a machine. I'm sure you've guessed by now that the machine Herbert Benson is talking about here is the human heart. which delivers the number of times he has mentioned and the amount of fuel that is mentioned, is the blood to various parts of the body, supplying to each part of the body the oxygen and the nutrients which are needed in different parts of the body. So it takes care of the entire human machine, this one machine, the human heart. With that, now we can go to the PowerPoint presentation. So this is the man, Herbert Benson, who discovered the relaxation response. And he passed away only this year on the 3rd of February. He graduated from the Harvard Medical School, one of the top medical schools of the world, in the year 1961. And he went on to work at his alma mater most of his life. He specialized in cardiology. And in the 1960s, he made some observations in Puerto Rico. He found that those who were living on the islands, the people who were rather rural in their lifestyle, they had high blood pressure only occasionally. Most of the time, most of them had normal blood pressures, whereas those who lived on the mainland and had urbanized lifestyles were the ones who had a high prevalence of high blood pressure. And he intuitively guessed that this has something more to do than with the physical factors like diet and exercise, and probably had, he thought, something to do with the mind. So this man, already had a mind which was open to this type of a mind-body relationship. And based on this observation, he thought, let me do some studies. So he was at heart not just a physician and a cardiologist, but also a basic scientist, a physiologist. So he entered the physiology labs of the Harvard Medical School and started doing some experiments on monkeys. And the experiments were such that the monkeys were being trained to raise voluntarily raise or lower their blood pressure voluntarily using reward and punishment. This was based on the model which Skinner had made very popular, that you can change the behavior of animals using a reward and punishment system. The animals maximize the behavior which leads to a reward and try to avoid the type of behavior which leads to punishment. This is again common sense, and nobody can understand it better than married people. After marriage, gradually both the partners start realizing what is it that pleases the other partner and what is it that is likely to annoy him or her. And they gradually start repeating more and more the type of behavior which leads to the partner being happy. So that is the reward, and start avoiding the behavior which will lead to a punishment. So the rats which Skinner trained were doing exactly that. But then can this also apply to things like blood pressure? Because blood pressure depends upon the heart rate and the caliber of the blood vessels. That is how wide they are, how easily they're letting the blood flow. As in any pumping system, the pressure would depend upon how hard the pump is working, and also if it is pumping to a large number of tubes and channels, how narrow those tubes are. The narrower they get, the more the pressure will be. For example, at the end, if you have a nozzle where it's very narrow, you'd find that the water comes out like a jet at great pressure. So if the blood vessels are narrow, if the tubes are narrow, then the blood pressure will rise. So it depends. But we can't voluntarily control the way our heart beats. We can't control the extent to which our blood vessels are open. So how could the monkeys voluntarily do it? So this was something which was novel, and but all the same, he started doing these experiments. And to some extent, he succeeded in making the monkeys raise or lower their blood pressure voluntarily using reward and punishment systems. But then while he was doing those experiments, and perhaps it was because of those experiments that he was approached by Maharishi Mahesh Yogi and his followers, the adherents of the Transcendental Meditation System, the TM system of meditation. And they asked him, why are you working on monkeys? We can do it in human beings. Human beings, when they meditate, they can bring their blood pressure down voluntarily. So why not study human beings? To that, Herbert Benson initially said, no, thank you, but no. Because he thought that studying meditation would be something, which will not do much credit to him in the medical world. People would think that he has become crazy or something, he has lost his mind. This was something completely unthinkable. And that too, meditation, which is being promoted by a Swamiji. So completely unscientific work. So he said, no, thank you. But the yogi and his followers, and by then he had a large number of followers in the US, they were very persistent. So finally, this no changed into a yes, but there was a condition laid that if the findings of the experiments are negative, if the findings are such that they do harm to your movement, because this was a movement which the Maharshi was trying to spread in the US, which means then if you start losing your adherents, it does harm to your movement. If the results are negative or it does harm to your movement, still we will be free to publish the results and you will continue to cooperate in the studies. It's not that you drop out midway, now the results are not good, so now we'll not give you any other further subjects for the experiments. And still, because of one more thing which he did, because he was very afraid of what the other colleagues in the Harvard Medical School would think, he said that we'll do it on this condition that even if the results are negative, you publish, and you will enter the lab through a side door after office hours. That is the time we'll do the experiments on you. So all these conditions were laid down and they were all accepted by Maharshi Mahesh Yogi because he was very confident that the results will be good and positive. And what was the technique? Those of you who are not familiar with the technique of transcendental meditation, the technique consists of a mantra. I put mantra in quotes because they don't necessarily give any traditional mantra. They just give sometimes a very neutral sound. And this sound, which is given to the person who is learning transcendental meditation, is unique to that particular person. So they say that we will give a mantra or sound which is best suited for that particular person's personality. So they give you a questionnaire so that their personality can be assessed. And depending upon your personality, the person is given a mantra. Probably here the principle involved is that if the person is in any case spiritually oriented, then they may give him one of the traditional mantras. If he is not, then they'll give him a neutral sound so that he doesn't feel that he is indulging in any traditional spiritual practice. So then they'll give him a very neutral sound. So this mantra or the sound is whispered into the ear of the person who is learning, and he's told, this is your mantra or your sound. It's specially for you, and you have to keep it confidential. Don't divulge it to anybody. Keep it a secret. And then he's told that you have to chant this silently, 20 minutes in the morning and 20 minutes in the evening. No other change in the lifestyle required. So very clear-cut, well-defined technique. And that is what suited Herbert Benson also, because in scientific experiments, this type of a cut and dry technique, which is very specific, is very suitable as compared to a technique which may involve too many things and too many changes and too many variables, which could then vary from one person to the other person meditating. So this was a technique which was rather suitable for scientific experimentation. And of course, they were told that while you are chanting silently in the morning and the evening for 20 minutes, then adopt a passive attitude. Don't try to fight any thoughts, but at the same time, don't engage in any thoughts. So some of the basic principles, which are common to meditative techniques, they were told a few such simple things about what they should do when they are silently chanting this mantra or the sound that they have been given. Now, so Herbert Benson did these experiments on a large number of subjects. The age range was from 17 to 41 years, and some of them had practiced it for as long as 9 years. Those who had practiced for long periods of time were the adherents, who had learned transcendental meditation out of a sense of devotion, and they had been practicing it for a long time. But then he took many other subjects also who came only out of curiosity. Let's see what it is about. And normally one would have expected in a country like the US, not many people to be interested in Swamiji's practice, but because associated with him was Herbert Benson, a person with a medical degree from an Ivy League university and doing a scientific study. So he could attract a large number of people who may not have had any spiritual inclination, but at least they were curious about what the technique was like and what the findings will be. So he attracted not only the TM adherents, but also some students, mathematicians, artists, businessmen, all types of people from other walks of life in a wide range who learned it for a short period, or sometimes even less than 1 month, and then they were into the experiment. And the experimental protocol was that after coming to the lab, they'll just sit quietly for 20 to 30 minutes, then practice transcendental meditation for 20 to 30 minutes, and then again sit quietly for 20 to 30 minutes. So in 1 to 1.5 hours, the experiment will be over for each individual. And what did he find? He found that, of course, the blood pressure fell. That is what he was trying to do in the monkeys. Now here there were human beings who could also voluntarily bring down their blood pressure by practicing this technique. Their heart rate also fell, but then that was not all that happened. He found that the oxygen consumption came down. Just notice the scale here. This will be important when we go further. Say the experiment was about 1 hour. So the scale shows from 0 to 60 minutes. So this was the duration of the experiment. And it is the middle period during which the person was actually meditating. And it is during this middle period that the oxygen consumption has fallen drastically. Of course, looks more drastic than it really is because of the scale. Say it has dropped from about 250 to about 210 milliliters or cubic centimeters per minute. So that is the reduction in the oxygen consumption. So the person seems to be needing less oxygen. Okay. And we need less oxygen when we are spending less energy. So the person is spending very little energy and therefore consuming very little oxygen. However, it may be that he's needing more oxygen, but somehow due to some reason, he's not able to get enough. So how about that? That was shown that that was not the case because blood lactate levels also came down, again, roughly around the same period when the person was meditating. Now, what is blood lactate? Blood lactate gives us an idea of how much energy is being used, but the commensurate amount of oxygen is not available. So, for example, the person runs a sprint. The oxygen consumption during that 15 seconds, 30 seconds, or whatever the person is running extremely fast, the oxygen consumption is very high. And his breathing can't cope with it. Hardly has his breathing really picked up and started, breathing hard and fast, and his heart has also started breathing fast and hard. By the time that has happened, the sprint is over, which means that the large amount of oxygen that he consumed during the sprint has been used up in some other way. Oxygen for that came from somewhere else. Actually, oxygen didn't come from anywhere else. The fuel was not burnt down completely. So when glucose is not burnt down completely or fat is not burnt down completely, when fuel is not burnt down completely, what we accumulate in the blood is lactate. So here there was lactate was not getting accumulated. And then what happens when the person, say after a sprint or a race or any exercise in which the oxygen supply was not commensurate with the requirements, when the person stops the exercise, by the time he finishes the exercise, he has incurred an oxygen debt, which means he was getting into the body less oxygen that was really necessary. And the evidence for that is blood lactate has built up. Now that he's at rest, he can continue breathing fast for some time. His heart can continue to function at a higher level for some time. And we all experienced it, that if you have strenuous exercise for some time, even when you stop the exercise, your heart may be still pounding. If heart is not pounding, at least you are breathing much faster and harder than usual. So you are getting extra oxygen in, although you are at rest and you don't need that extra oxygen at that time. You are using this extra oxygen to pay off the debt incurred. And as you get this pay off the debt, the blood lactate level again comes down. Now here, there are people who have taken no exercise, who are completely at rest, but were using much less oxygen than is normally required at rest. Here also the person is at rest and quiet. So at that during that restful period, he was needing this much oxygen per minute, but during meditation, it has been brought down further. And along with that, we know that this was the low level of oxygen consumption, which was actually required, which means the person's oxygen requirements genuinely came down because the blood lactate levels also in fact fell. So the requirement had actually genuinely come down. Now, this type of a thing, oxygen requirement following below the normal level, happens also in sleep. Because, there's a certain amount of energy that we need when we are doing nothing, just sitting quietly or lying down quietly, but we are awake. But then when we fall asleep at night, the oxygen requirement falls still further, the way it has happened here. So is this process something like sleep? Now that comes out in the next graph. The person is awake. The oxygen consumption has come down as it happens during sleep. But then what is the difference between sleep and this phenomenon? That comes out in the next one. Now notice the scale here. The scale here is from 0 to 7 hours, because that is around the time when we sleep. And out of this 1 hour is roughly the time in which the person meditates. It's not that the person is doing both the things on the same day or same time. The sleep, graph is a standard graph of, may not have been done on these subjects, but we know this is what happens in sleep. Scientists, know that. And this is what happens during meditation. And this is what Herbert Benson called the relaxation response. Notice that carefully, that here, this middle period, that is the middle period of 20 minutes or so, when the person was meditating, during that period, the oxygen consumption has fallen very steeply. And during meditation, it remained very low. When the meditation was over, it again went up very steeply. Now this fall is very sharp. The rise is also very sharp, but the level reached is much lower than we reach at any time in sleep. In sleep, the person goes to sleep. Gradually, the oxygen consumption keeps coming down, keeps on till about 6 hours. And then when the person is about to get up, that is the time when the oxygen consumption again starts going up. So this is very different from sleep. Here it is a slow fall and not a very marked fall. Here the fall is more drastic and it is extremely sharp. So that is the difference. So that's why I said this is a process which is very different from sleep. The person can do it voluntarily when the person meditates. And since during this, the oxygen requirement is very low, and we use oxygen for our metabolism. So it's a hypometabolic state. Hypo means low. So the person is achieving a hypometabolic state through meditation. And this was published in the American Journal of Physiology in the year 1971 in the September issue. And the title of the paper was "Wakeful," means not sleeping. The person is not sleeping. Hypometabolic, physiologic means it's a normal state. It's not a disease condition. Physiologic means it's a normal state. It happens to normal people. So wakeful, hypometabolic, physiologic state. And Keith Wallace was one of the devotees of Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, and A.F. Wilson might have been another devotee, or maybe one of the young people working in Herbert Benson's lab. These experiments were done in Herbert Benson's lab. Wallace had just finished his PhD and he went to the Benson's lab in Harvard, and they did these experiments together. So here is the paper that was published, which has now become a classic. After a little more than 50 years since it was published, it still continues to be quoted very extensively. So the relaxation response is an integrated response, which means all these things: fall in the heart rate, fall in the blood pressure, fall in the oxygen consumption, fall in lactate levels. All these things are happening together. It's an integrated response of the body. But it is quite opposite to the fright-flight-fight response. And the body is equipped for both. Now, what is the fright, flight, and fight response? Interestingly, the fright, flight, and fight response was also studied in the same laboratory by Walter Cannon, who is one of the most respected physiologists. Much earlier, he was 1871 to 1945, you can see. So he studied this sometime around the year 1910, Walter Cannon. And what he found was that when an animal is frightened, it leads to visible bodily changes, which seem to be voluntary, and also autonomic changes, which are not voluntary. Both types of changes happen when an animal is afraid. Now, what is the voluntary response? Either flight or fight. Means if the animal knows that I can't fight this enemy of whom I am frightened, the animal tries to run away. On the other hand, if he thinks that the enemy is weak, he may put up a fight. So fright, flight, and fight, during all these, what happens is that the heart rate goes up, there's an increase in the blood pressure, increase in oxygen consumption, which is just the opposite of what was happening during the relaxation response. And of course, there are voluntary changes, as you have seen. Say if there is a cat which is afraid, it runs away. If a cat is angry, then it has a different type of response. When a dog is trying to sort of frighten another dog, there's another type of. So from the body, you can make out what the mood of the animal is. But along with that, there also are taking place these changes which are not under the control of our willpower. The body is just equipped. And why is the body equipped to do that? Because during flight and fight, both, the animal is exercising. That is one thing common. It both need an effort. And when a muscular effort is needed and exercise is needed, the muscles will consume more oxygen. And to cope with it, the heart rate goes up, oxygen consumption goes up. Therefore, the respiratory rate will also go up. The respiratory depth will go up. And on the whole, the blood vessels in many parts of the body will constrict to allow for more blood flow to the muscles. And along with that, because the heart is pumping faster, all these things put together will also lead to an increase in the blood pressure. So this is a mechanism which is designed to make the animal cope with the additional exercise or exertion required, physical effort required when the animal faces an emergency. This is an emergency response. Now, this response is also built into human beings, but there's a difference. Human beings do not always run away or put up a fight. That is not civilized behavior. So when we are facing suppose you are facing the boss and the boss is shouting at you, you can neither run away from there nor can you hit the boss. But at the same time, the heart rate goes up and the blood pressure goes up. That does happen, which means that this is happening, but the purpose for which this was designed is not happening. The purpose was that you should be able to cope with physical exercise better, but you are not taking any additional physical exercise. Human beings don't do that, which means that if this type of things start happening repeatedly to a human being, where he's going through some sort of a stressful response, an acute stressful response, his blood pressure is increasing every time, but it is serving no purpose because there was no physical exertion involved. And if this happens frequently enough, this increase in the blood pressure becomes steady. So this is one of the ways in which even repeated acute stress can lead to high blood pressure. So that's what happens in human beings. But then nature has built into human beings one more thing which probably animals don't do. Nature has built into human beings also a response which the human being himself can engineer, which will prevent this type of a thing from happening. And that is what the relaxation response is. So these are two opposite type of responses. The body is equipped with both, especially the human body. We can't be sure whether an animal can also meditate and relax and bring down the blood pressure. But the human body is equipped with both. But there's a difference. The fight, flight, and fright response, I call it 3F response, is involuntary. The animal doesn't have to do anything about it. It just happens. You can't even stop it from happening. A human being knows it is useless for me, but he can't stop it from happening. It happens even in the human being. On the other hand, the relaxation response is voluntary. It is in the control of willpower. Not only it is under the control of willpower, anybody can learn it, which means it's not that it takes a very special type of person who can learn it. People with less than 1 month of training of transcendental meditation could also learn it enough to get a similar response. I'm not trying to say that the other deeper and more spiritual aspects of meditation are not necessary or they're useless. But for this limited purpose, what we can see is that our brain is so wired that any human being can voluntarily learn in a very rather relatively easy a technique by which he can bring down his blood pressure voluntarily on his own whenever he wants, which means that he can control his mind enough to get reflected in these bodily responses like the blood pressure. So this is the relaxation response which Herbert Benson discovered on these subjects who practiced transcendental meditation. This book was published in 1975 and sold more than 4 million copies. By now it might have further gone up. Then, he didn't confine himself to transcendental meditation. Herbert Benson started studying other techniques of meditation. For example, here you can see him in conversation with the Dalai Lama when the Dalai Lama visited Boston in 1979. So he studied the Buddhist system of meditation. He studied many other systems of meditation and came to the conclusion that they have something in common. And he found that the relaxation response that he discovered while the subjects were doing transcendental meditation was not specific to transcendental meditation. It happens with any meditative technique. And he found that all meditative techniques have 4 basic features. One is that the person sits in a quiet environment. Secondly, he sits in a comfortable posture. Thirdly, he uses a mental device which reduces the ordinary chaotic surface activity of the mind. It may be repetition of a mantra, or it may be mindfulness, or whatever. These are all mental devices. And the person adopts a passive attitude. What this passive attitude means is that the person does not struggle with the thoughts. He does not try to necessarily stop them, but he doesn't engage with them. And he does not try to raise unnecessarily any doubts and questions in his mind about the technique or about what he's doing. He just lets himself be, and passively just accepts that what I'm doing is good, it will be useful. So he adopts a passive attitude. He doesn't raise unnecessary questions and doubts. So his intellect is at peace. He has a passive attitude, and also it may include a passive surrender to whatever is happening, that whatever happens is a part of the divine will, and so on and so forth. So all this passive attitude. So these are the 4 basic features of any meditative technique. That's what he found. And that the response, relaxation response, is not specific to TM or transcendental meditation. Actually, in a way, you can say all meditative techniques are to some extent transcendental. Because what does transcendental mean? Transcendental means going beyond something. All meditative techniques aim at going beyond our ordinary human limitations. So in that sense, all meditative techniques are transcendental in their approach, in their aim. And then he also found that the use of these meditative techniques need not be restricted to high blood pressure. And he started treating a wide variety of patients with the same approach, like people having heart disease or tension headache or menstrual problem irregularities. So he started treating a large variety of patients using this approach. He put together a well-defined program so that people could go through 1 week of a program or something like that, during which they could do, and then the rest they could follow on their own at their homes. So he put together a clear, well-defined program which all these types of patients could practice. And same time, he of course maintained that it is not a substitute for drugs or surgery. It's not an either or approach. It may reduce the dose of the drugs required. In some cases, one may be able to avoid surgery, but it is not a substitute. Those things may still be necessary. However, what he achieved was that what was a heresy once upon a time, to think of things like meditative techniques, that too being taught by a spiritual master, something which was unthinkable in modern medicine, in his own lifetime, it came to be considered as something common sense, which is just common sense. So there was a great deal of acceptance over a period of 30 years or so, which happened during his own lifetime. He studied these subjects and published the Relaxation Response in 1975. By the year 2005, within 30 years, this had become quite acceptable to modern medicine. So this was a great thing. When I met Herbert Benson in the year 2003, he said that I owe great debt to India. I learned a lot from that great country. And the other gentleman you see here was also working in his lab and is one of the very well-known researchers in the field of yoga. Particularly in 2 areas, he's well known. His earlier research was on the use of yogic techniques in the treatment of insomnia, that is sleeplessness, difficulty in falling asleep. And his recent work is on introducing yoga in American schools. And he has been very successful at popularizing it in schools and getting it accepted in schools. His name is Satbir Khalsa. Don't be carried away by his name and his beard. He was born and brought up in Canada, a Christian, then converted into Sikhism later, and has done much of his professional work in the United States at Harvard. So, and then of course, he had a few other younger colleagues who were studying the same thing from another angle. For example, they were trying to see whether there are any changes in the brain, structural changes in the brain, chemical changes in the brain, which can all be studied, through techniques like the MRI these days. So they were trying to see whether such changes are taking place in regular meditators. And in fact, those changes also do happen. And there is quite a bit of evidence for that. So this is sort of briefly his career. And you can see it is a very bright career, illustrated sort of career which anybody would like to have. But at the same time, because of the difficulty in getting his work on the mind-body relationship accepted, he maintained both identities as a cardiologist and also as a mind-body specialist for a very long time before he switched over completely to mind-body medicine. So graduated from the school and then specialized in cardiology, went on to establish the Mind-Body Institute at Harvard Medical School in 1992, became a professor of mind-body medicine at that same place. And then after retirement, he got a big grant from a philanthropist, I think James Henry. And with that was established an institution, the Benson Henry Institute, which is a mind-body institute at Mass General Hospital, which is a big hospital associated, again, affiliated to the Harvard Medical School. And he established a organization, the American Institute of Stress, of which he was the founder trustee, published more than 190 scientific papers in his life, wrote 12 books, of which more than 5 million copies have been sold. And these books have been translated into many languages. But the most famous remains this classic, The Relaxation Response. So he saw heresy turn into an accepted idea in his lifetime, which is always a great satisfaction. But that did not stop this revolutionary thinker from picking up another heresy for scientific exploration. Guess what it was? In 1996, he got a $2.4 million grant from the John Templeton Foundation. This foundation, specializes in supporting all types of science-religion dialogue. And with the help of this grant, he undertook a decade-long study on the healing power of prayer. We'll not go into these studies today. We'll take them up on the last Saturday of June, because the person who is really better known for the healing power of prayer and putting it into mainstream medicine is Larry Dossey. We'll talk about him on the last Sunday of June. So we'll not go into this much further. But then Herbert Benson was a pioneer in this also. And in 1998, he organized a conference on this subject in Harvard. So you see, if the Mecca of modern medicine, Harvard Medical School, decides to look at something like the healing power of prayer and organizes an international conference for it, that itself gives a certain respectability to the subject. So he made this type of a subject also respectable and acceptable in scientific research. His obituary, published on the 17th of February 2022 in the New York Times, one of the things that obituary said was that Herbert Benson always took care to say that even if his research was 100% accurate, meditation and prayer could never replace drugs and surgery completely. Which means they could replace maybe sometimes reduce the dose of drugs, but one can't take it as an either or approach. Both medical treatment and spiritual care, he said, were necessary, a fact that Western medicine had long tried to ignore. They ignored the spiritual care part, and one that Herbert Benson spent his career trying to correct. He tried to correct that imbalance. This is one of his best known quotes. There's something called the physiology of forgiveness, which means you have bodily changes resulting from emotions, including the emotion or thought of forgiveness. Being unable to forgive other people's faults is harmful to one's health. So not only smoking is injurious to health, not forgiving somebody is also harmful to health. Okay, that's also injurious to health. I put down some of the sources that I have consulted for putting this together. Most important being this obituary published in the New York Times on 17 February, and this is the link to that obituary. Wikipedia has a good page on Herbert Benson, and then some of the pictures are from Google Images, and some have been scanned from the book Relaxation Response. We always love to hear from you. Besides any questions or comments that you may have at the end of the session, you're always welcome to write us on yes@yesspirituality.com. Gratitude to the Mother and Sri Aurobindo for making this session possible. Next Saturday, we'll talk about the man who established the efficacy of yoga in heart disease. Next Saturday, 11th of June, same time, 6 p.m. Indian Standard Time, Dean Ornish, whose best known book is The Reversal of Heart Disease. Thank you. Thank you, the person who joined from Netherlands. So if there are no questions, then thank you all for being there. And we'll meet again same time next Saturday and talk about the Nornish.
Thank you.